Isoroku Yamamoto was not born into the life of a warrior admiral. He was born into the quiet struggles of Japan that was still finding its place in the modern world. The year was 1884, and his childhood was marked less by grandeur and more by the quiet rhythms of a modest household. He was the son of a schoolteacher, a man who valued discipline, knowledge, and humility. These early years planted seeds in him that later would shape his decisions in ways few of his countrymen could fully understand. He would learn to revere tradition, but also to question it when his instincts told him it was no longer enough. Even as a boy, he bore the scars of Japan's history, the kind that pressed upon his spirit. During the Russo-Japanese War, he lost 2 fingers at Tsushima when he was just a young officer, a reminder etched into his body that war was not a game of glory, but a brutal ledger that exacted its price in blood and bone. The wound never truly healed, not just because of the missing fingers, but because of what he learned from it. Every time he looked at his hand, he saw not a badge of honor, but a reminder how fragile men were, how easy it was to underestimate one's enemy, and how swiftly fortunes could change. That lesson stayed with him all his life, making him both respected and resented. For Yamamoto was a man of paradox, fiercely loyal to his country, yet deeply aware of the storms it was sailing toward. In the years that followed, Yamamoto's life took him far from the narrow streets of his hometown and into the heart of America, a place that would leave a profound mark on his mind and soul. He arrived not as a conqueror, not as a spy, but as a student eager to learn. Harvard University in the early 20th century was a world apart from Japan, loud, sprawling, filled with an energy of possibility that Yamamoto could feel in every lecture hall and library. He studied economics, absorbing not only the dry numbers, but also the rhythm of a nation that seemed built on innovation and relentless drive. To his classmates, he was quiet, polite, often reserved, yet they could not help but notice the way he listened with a seriousness that most of them never mustered. America was not simply another foreign land to him. It was a revelation. What struck Yamamoto most was not only the wealth of the technology, but the spirit of ordinary Americans. He marveled at how working men carried themselves with confidence, how even factory laborers believed that tomorrow could be brighter than today. He saw baseball games and realized that the sport was more than pastime. It was metaphor, a lesson in patience, teamwork, and resilience. He saw young men and women who questioned authority, who dared to speak openly to professors, to debate, to disagree. In Japan, such boldness might have been frowned upon. In America, it was celebrated. He learned to admire that spirit, and somewhere deep inside, he feared what it could mean should Japan ever cross paths with such a nation in battle. After Harvard, his journey continued. He traveled across the United States, and he was not blind to its contradictions. He saw poverty in the streets of immigrant neighborhoods. He saw racial prejudice. He saw flaws and imperfections. But even with all that, the scale of American potential was staggering. The oil fields in Texas, the sprawling factories in Detroit, the steel that built bridges and skyscrapers, all of it whispered to him the same truth. America's capacity for war was like a giant sleeping across the ocean, and heaven help anyone who tried to wake it. He took long train rides across the continent, staring out at landscapes that seemed to stretch forever. In those quiet moments, he thought of Japan, a chain of islands, small and vulnerable, proud and ambitious, but limited by nature's geography. Could such a country, however disciplined, truly stand against the weight of this vast, resource-rich colossus? Yamamoto knew the answer in his bones, though he dared not speak it loudly. If the day came when Japan and America crossed swords, it would not be a short contest, and Japan would bleed itself dry. Yet he could not simply adopt the American way of life and abandon his homeland. He was Japanese through and through, bound by duty, honor, and the weight of ancestors who had carried swords long before rifles ever reached their shores. He returned to his country with a heart divided, one part filled with admiration for America's vitality, another filled with worry for Japan's choices, and still another chained by loyalty to the emperor and the navy. In Tokyo, among fellow officers, he sometimes spoke cautiously of what he'd seen. He warned that America was not the soft, indulgent land some Japanese nationalists claimed it to be. They believed Americans lacked spirit, that they were spoiled by wealth and comfort, that they could not endure hardship. Yamamoto knew better. He had seen steel workers sweat through 14-hour days, He had seen families sacrificed during hard times. He had felt the restless ambition that coursed through the veins of this young, confident country. He said more than once to his peers, "You do not know the Americans as I do. I have seen them. If we fight them, we will awaken something far more powerful than we imagine." Many dismissed him, calling him overly cautious, even timid. Some whispered that his time in America had softened him, that he was not fully loyal to Japan. But Yamamoto's loyalty was beyond question. What they failed to understand was that true loyalty did not mean blind obedience. It meant caring enough to warn of dangers that others refused to see. As the years passed, Japan's path grew darker. The military gained more control, nationalism hardened, and whispers of expansion became shouts. Yamamoto, by then a rising figure in the Navy, watched with unease. He believed Japan's destiny lay not in reckless conquest, but in careful modernization and diplomacy. Yet he was one man, and the tide of history is rarely turned by warnings alone. He would often recall his time in America when he was invited to social gatherings or meetings with government leaders. Cigarette smoke would hang in the air, voices would grow heated, and some would boast that America was a paper tiger, a giant that would crumble under the first hard blow. Yamamoto would remain silent for a time, then speak in his calm, measured voice. "If we are forced into war with America, I can run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. But beyond that, there is nothing I can promise." The room would grow quiet, the bravado dimming, but only for a moment. His warning was heard, but not heeded. For Yamamoto, it was not mere strategy. It was personal. He thought of the young American students he had debated at Harvard, of the laughter he had shared with strangers on long train rides, of the optimism he had felt in the hum of American cities. He knew that behind the machinery and the money, there was a will that could not be easily crushed. War with such a nation was not simply dangerous. It was folly. But he also knew his place. He was a servant in Japan, and when orders came, he would obey them, even if they led to the abyss. That was the tragedy of Yamamoto. He was both prophet and prisoner, a man who could see the storm on the horizon, but who could not steer his ship away from it. He was caught between his love for his homeland and his respect for the truth he had learned abroad. The coming years would test him in ways even he could not fully imagine. And though his warnings echoed in the halls of Tokyo, the drums of war grew louder, drowning out his voice. As he aged, he carried himself with a quiet dignity. He read, he wrote, he reflected. Those close to him said there was always a shadow in his eyes, as though he bore knowledge that weighed too heavily for one man. And perhaps he did. He knew that nations, like men, often choose pride over wisdom, and that pride, once set aflame, is nearly impossible to extinguish. The lesson was there for anyone to see, yet few chose to learn it. By the late 1930s, the world was darkening and Japan stood at a crossroads. In Tokyo, voices of the army thundered with visions of empire. They spoke of destiny, of Asia freed from Western domination, of resources and power that would secure Japan's place as the sun that would never set. The Navy, though more cautious, was drawn along by the current. Oil, steel, and raw materials were needed to sustain a growing nation and a hungry military machine. And the United States, with its embargoes and sanctions, stood as both obstacle and threat. Isoroku Yamamoto watched this march with a mixture of dread and resignation. By then, he was no longer a student gazing across American landscapes. He was a seasoned admiral with responsibilities that stretched far beyond his personal opinions. His hair carried streaks of gray. His reputation for brilliance was solid, and yet his heart was troubled. He had argued, pleaded even, against rash war with the United States, reminding his superiors of the lessons he had learned. But Japan was already on a path where reason was drowned out by pride and fear. The pressure was immense. Nationalists denounced him in whispers, and sometimes openly. Threats on his life circulated in letters and pamphlets. He was accused of being too enamored with America, of being unpatriotic, of being weak. But Yamamoto was not weak. He was a man bound by duty, and when duty called him to lead Japan's naval forces, he did not hesitate. If his country insisted on playing a dangerous game, then he would play it as skillfully as possible, not for his own sake, but for the men under his command and the honor of the service he loved. In those years, the meetings of Japan's military leadership were charged with tension. Around long tables covered in maps and documents, voices would rise, fists would pound, and the vision of war would be painted as glorious and swift. Yamamoto's words cut through that noise like a cold wind. We can run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. But beyond that, I can give no guarantees. The silence that followed was not agreement, but discomfort. They wanted certainty, not honesty. Yet Yamamoto would not give them illusions. When the idea of striking Pearl Harbor was first raised, it was seen as audacious, perhaps even reckless. But it soon gathered momentum, fueled by the belief that a decisive blow could cripple the American fleet and force the United States to the negotiating table. Yamamoto opposed war in principle, but once the decision was made, he threw himself into planning with the full measure of his talent. It was a paradox of his life. To fight a war he did not believe in, he became its most brilliant architect. The months of preparation were filled with secrecy and intensity. Yamamoto oversaw details, considered every possibility, and pushed his subordinates to think creatively. He insisted on training pilots for torpedo runs in shallow water, solving problems that others had dismissed as impossible. He studied the psychology of surprise, the timing of dawn attacks, the distance carriers would need to travel undetected. To those who served under him, he appeared relentless, almost tireless. Yet those who knew him more closely sensed a burden in his eyes. He was a man constructing a weapon he prayed might never be needed. On the eve of the operation, Yamamoto wrote to friends in Japan that he felt as though he were preparing to gamble everything on a single throw of dice. He did not glorify it. He did not revel in it. He knew what it meant. In the first 6 months to a year of war with the United States and Great Britain, he confided, "I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." It was not defeatism, but realism. He had seen too much of America not to know the truth. The morning of December 7th, 1941, arrived with the skies above Hawaii painted in soft light, a dawn that promised peace to those who slept beneath it. But from the decks of Japanese carriers far out at sea, the air roared with engines as wave after wave of planes lifted into the sky. Yamamoto was not there. He remained with the fleet, awaiting word. But his heart was heavy. He had authorized the plan, he had prepared to strike. Yet he could not escape the thought that this attack would not end the conflict. It would ignite one. The news of success came swiftly. Battleships burned in Pearl Harbor's waters. Planes lay shattered on runways. Smoke curled into the sky. Japan rejoiced. Across the empire, newspapers proclaimed the triumph. People cheered in the streets, and voices shouted that America had been humbled. But Yamamoto did not celebrate. His face was grave when he received the reports, his silence louder than any words. To some, it seemed he should have been elated, yet those who knew him understood. He saw beyond the victory to the storm that would follow. That night, as others toasted, Yamamoto withdrew to his quarters. He thought of the men who had died, American sailors trapped in steel coffins at the bottom of the harbor. He thought of the sleeping giant he had just struck. He thought of the warnings he had given, the warnings unheeded. In his private reflections, he is said to have murmured words that capture the essence of his heart. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." The months that followed seemed, at first, to prove him right and wrong at once. Japan swept across the Pacific with breathtaking speed. Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, Malaya, all fell in rapid succession. The Navy did indeed run wild, just as Yamamoto had predicted. Morale soared in Tokyo. Voices that once doubted him now praised him. Yet each victory brought him no joy. He carried in his mind the ticking clock of his own prophecy. 6 months, perhaps a year. And then the tide would turn and all the triumphs would be paid for in ruin. Yamamoto worked tirelessly during this period, moving his fleets, managing campaigns, and trying to stretch Japan's fragile advantage as far as it could go. He knew that every battle, every island, every ship was part of a larger equation. Japan could seize territory, yes, but it could not manufacture oil out of air, nor steel out of water. America's factories, untouched and unbombed, were already gearing for war. He pictured them in his mind, assembly lines humming, young workers flooding plants, ships sliding down ramps into the sea. He had seen those factories years before. He knew what they could do. Even in the flush of victory, he pressed for caution. He argued against overextending, urged careful planning, and warned that the Americans were learning, adapting, preparing. Yet the momentum of conquest carried Japan forward. Leaders spoke of destiny again, of new orders in Asia, of triumphs that would last 1,000 years. Yamamoto, loyal as ever, continued to lead, but in the quiet of night, his thoughts were darker. He knew history's cruel rhythm, that empires intoxicated by victory often sow the seeds of their own undoing. There was also the matter of conscience. Yamamoto was a man of war, but not without humanity. He respected his enemies as much as his allies, a rare quality in those days. He wrote letters to his wife, expressing not triumph but weariness, not pride but worry for the future his children might inherit. In his reflections, one hears not the boasting of a conqueror, but the sorrow of a man who sees too clearly what lies ahead. The Americans, meanwhile, did not crumble. They rallied. Men enlisted in droves. Factories surged to life, and the shock of Pearl Harbor turned to resolve. President Roosevelt's words, broadcast across radios, united a nation. Yamamoto's worst fears began to unfold. The giant was awake. For the first time, Japan's leaders began to realize what Yamamoto had known all along, that this war would not be a quick negotiation at the point of the sword, but a long and punishing struggle. Through it all, Yamamoto continued to lead with a mix of brilliance and melancholy. His strategies remained sharp, his respect among his men unshaken. But those close to him knew he bore a private burden. He had warned, he had predicted, and now he watched his prophecy edge closer with each passing month. The victories that thrilled his nation were, to him, only preludes to the reckoning he knew must come. By the summer of 1942, the clock on Yamamoto's prediction was running out. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor, and Japan stood at the height of its expansion. From the shores of New Guinea to the jungles of Burma, from the islands of the Philippines to the coral reefs of the South Pacific, the rising sun flew triumphantly. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. Supplies strained under the vast distances. Ships and planes lost in early battles could not be replaced as easily as America's industrial giant was now proving capable of doing. Yamamoto, with his keen eye for balance, knew the tide was shifting. It was in this climate that he conceived what he hoped might be the decisive blow, a trap at Midway. He believed that by luring the remaining American carriers into battle, he could crush them and force the United States into negotiations before its strength fully matured. The plan was ambitious, complex, and risky. Yamamoto's staff admired his daring, but even they worried about the gamble. For Yamamoto himself, it was not born of overconfidence, but of desperation. He knew that time was no ally. If Japan did not break America's will quickly, then the future would be grim indeed. The Battle of Midway, fought in June 1942, was a turning point that Yamamoto had long feared. Instead of luring the Americans into destruction, the Japanese fleet walked into an ambush of its own. For Japan's prize carriers were lost, their decks consumed by fire, their air crews swallowed by the sea. Yamamoto, aboard his flagship far from the immediate battle, received the reports with a stoic calm that belied the devastation in his heart. His officers looked to him, searching for anger or despair, but he offered neither. "The fate of war is always uncertain," he said quietly. "We must endure." Endurance, however, could not erase the reality. Midway was a catastrophe for which Japan would never fully recover. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Yamamoto's prophecy was fulfilled almost in a month. 6 months of running wild, and then the tide turned. For the rest of the war, Japan would be on the defensive, fighting not for expansion, but for survival. And Yamamoto, ever loyal, continued to lead, though with a heart more burdened than ever. His men still revered him. To them, he was not just an admiral, but a figure of steadiness, a man who carried himself with dignity even in defeat. He inspired them not with false promises, but with the strength of his character. Yet in the quiet of his own mind, he knew what lay ahead. He had seen the machine that was America, and now it was fully awake, churning out ships, planes, and weapons in numbers beyond comprehension. The war was no longer a matter of bold strategy. It was a matter of arithmetic, and the math was not on Japan's side. In 1943, as the Allies pushed steadily forward, Yamamoto remained a symbol of Japan's Navy. He traveled often to inspect bases, to encourage weary men, to lend his presence as a reminder that they were not forgotten. His visits mattered. Soldiers and sailors who saw him felt a renewed spirit, as though his very appearance was proof that their sacrifices were not in vain. Yamamoto understood this role. He gave his time, his words, his presence, even as his health waned and his spirit grew heavy. Duty to him was not negotiable. It was on one such journey that fate finally caught him. American intelligence, having broken Japanese codes, learned of Yamamoto's planned inspection tour bases in the Solomon Islands. They knew the exact time his plane would take off, the route it would fly, and the landing point he intended. The decision was made at the highest levels. Yamamoto was too important a figure, too irreplaceable a leader, to be allowed to continue. His death would strike a blow not only to Japanese command, but the morale of an entire nation. On the morning of April 18, 1943, Yamamoto boarded a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, accompanied by his staff and escorted by fighters. He wore his uniform with the same dignity as always, calm and composed, as though unaware of the danger that awaited. Perhaps, deep down, he knew. Some later claimed that he seemed unusually reflective that morning, as though burdened with an awareness of his own mortality. But he did not hesitate, for hesitation was not in his nature. High above the Solomon Islands, American P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted his formation. The air erupted in violence, bullets tearing through the sky. Yamamoto's plane was struck, engines failing, smoke trailing. Witnesses said the bomber descended in a graceful arc, as if refusing to fall chaotically, before crashing into the jungle below. When Japanese search teams reached the site later, they found Yamamoto's body still seated upright, hand resting near the hilt of his sword, his face calm, almost peaceful. He had died as he had lived, composed, dutiful, unflinching. The news of his death spread quickly through Japan. Shock and sorrow rippled across the empire. Soldiers wept openly. Sailors bowed their heads in silence, and civilians mourned a man they saw not only as a commander, but as a protector. Even his enemies in America respected him, though they had targeted him with precision. Many officers spoke of Yamamoto with admiration, recognizing him as a man of integrity, a warrior bound by honor even in a war he had not desired. What remained after his death was not just a memory of a man, but the lessons he embodied. Yamamoto's life was a tapestry of contradictions, loyalty and doubt, brilliance and tragedy, prophecy and obedience. He loved his country, yet he admired his enemy. He warned of disaster, yet he carried out the very strike that brought it about. He was both the architect of Pearl Harbor and the prophet of Japan's eventual defeat. Such contradictions make him not weaker, but profoundly human. For those who look back upon his story, especially generations who have never seen war firsthand, there are lessons to be drawn. One is the danger of pride. Yamamoto knew that Japan's pride would lead it into a war it could not win, yet he could not stop it. Pride is a powerful force, blinding nations and men alike to truths they do not wish to see. Another lesson is the burden of duty. Yamamoto fulfilled his role even when it conflicted with his beliefs, sacrificing personal comfort and peace for the sake of his country. Duty can be noble, but it can also bind a man to a course he knows is doomed. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all is the value of seeing one's adversary with clear eyes. Yamamoto respected America not as an ideal, but as a reality. He saw its strengths, its flaws, its resilience, and he measured them honestly. In a world that often thrives on caricature and underestimation of the other, his clarity stands as a reminder. To understand an opponent, one must first respect them. Without that respect, misjudgment follows, and misjudgment breeds catastrophe. Today, when people remember Yamamoto, they often recall his famous warning about running wild for 6 months, or his quiet fear of awakening a sleeping giant. But beyond the words lies the man himself, a boy from a teacher's family who rose to the highest ranks of his Navy, who lost fingers in his youth and carried the scars a lesson, who studied in foreign lands and learned to see beyond prejudice, who loved his homeland enough to fight for it even when he believed the fight was unwinnable. There is tragedy in such a life, Yes, but there's also nobility. His death did not end the war, nor did it save his nation, but it left behind a legacy of honesty in a time when honesty was rare. For older generations who have lived through their own struggles and seen the weight of choices, Yamamoto's story resonates not as a tale of distant battles, but as a mirror of the human condition, the struggle between duty and conscience, pride and wisdom, fate and free will. When one thinks of Yamamoto now, it is not only as the admiral who led Japan's navy, but as a man who knew the truth and bore it with dignity. His life reminds us that foresight does not always grant the power to change destiny, but it does grant the clarity to face it with courage. And perhaps that is a lesson worth carrying forward, that in moments when pride tempts us, when duty binds us, when the path ahead is shadowed, the greatest strength may not be in victory itself, but in the honesty to see things as they are and the resolve to walk forward nonetheless. And so his story closes not with a roar of guns, but with silence. A plane falling through the sky, a calm facing death, a prophecy fulfilled. The world moved on, nations rebuilt, time carried his name into history books. Yet for those who pause to remember, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto remains more than just a figure of war. He remains a man who saw too clearly, who warned too faithfully, and who lived too honorably to be forgotten.